Welcome to the Bare Metal Cyber Risk Prepcast. This series helps you prepare for the exam with focused explanations and practical context. IT operations are where most risk becomes real. In other words, systems are where controls succeed or fail. When things go wrong, it often starts with an unauthorized change, an outdated system, or an invisible asset. In other words, failures begin at the operational level. C-Risk emphasizes that risk oversight must be part of daily operations, not just strategy documents. In other words, policies are not enough. Execution must be governed. Operational failures like outages, downtime, or failed updates are often the precursors to security breaches or audit findings. In other words, small problems can lead to major incidents. On the C-Risk exam, expect questions that link infrastructure hygiene to control integrity and risk accountability. In other words, managing your environment supports managing risk. Change management is the structured process for handling modifications in the IT environment. In other words, it controls how systems evolve. It covers everything from software deployments to hardware replacements to configuration updates. In other words, any change should be planned and documented. The goal is to avoid unintended consequences, like outages, misconfigurations, or security gaps. In other words, changes should improve, not weaken, your environment. There are different types of changes. Standard changes are low risk and pre-approved. In other words, they follow a fast-track process. Emergency changes require rapid action but still need documentation. In other words, speed doesn't excuse poor records. Major changes go through full risk review, sign-off, and impact analysis. In other words, they require formal governance. C-Risk professionals must understand how these change types affect exposure and operational readiness. In other words, the type of change defines the level of control needed. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other podcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. Every effective change process includes specific controls to reduce risk. In other words, structure makes change safe. One is a change advisory board, or SAB, that evaluates requests for risk, timing, and business impact. In other words, a team checks every change. Another is formal impact and risk assessment, done before the change is made. In other words, consequences must be understood in advance. Pre-approval ensures that only authorized changes proceed, while rollback plans allow safe recovery if a change fails. In other words, have permission and a plan B. After the change, a post-implementation review checks if objectives were met and confirms there were no unintended effects. In other words, learn from the outcome. All change activity must be logged for traceability, audit, and incident response. In other words, every step should leave a trail. When change management is weak, the risk increases sharply. In other words, ungoverned change leads to exposure. Service disruption and downtime are the most obvious outcomes, but not the only ones. In other words, failure affects more than uptime. Vulnerabilities may be introduced when patches are applied incorrectly or without testing. In other words, a fix can become a flaw. Compliance failures can result when changes are made without documentation or approval. In other words, audit trails matter. If there's no rollback path, a failed update can cascade into a system outage. In other words, no backup means no recovery. On the C-Risk exam, clues like a patch caused an outage or change occurred without sign-off usually point to breakdowns in change control. In other words, the root cause is often missing governance. Asset management is just as critical. In other words, you can't protect what you can't see. It tracks the full life cycle of hardware, software, virtual machines, cloud instances, and even mobile devices. In other words, it monitors everything you rely on. It involves knowing what you have, where it is, who owns it, and what it does. In other words, asset records should answer basic risk questions. Proper asset management supports visibility for patching, software licensing, compliance, and data protection. In other words, control starts with a complete inventory. It's not just about inventory, it's about understanding the organization's full risk surface. In other words, every asset adds to your exposure. On the exam, asset gaps are often tied to risk blind spots, outdated controls, or inability to respond to incidents. In other words, missing assets mean missing accountability. Asset classification helps prioritize protection. In other words, not all assets are equal. Assets can be classified by sensitivity, function, criticality, or the data they store. In other words, define what matters most. These classifications inform how assets are monitored, which controls are used, and how recovery plans are designed. In other words, stronger assets need stronger defenses. Unclassified assets are often unmonitored, and misclassified ones receive the wrong level of protection. In other words, mistakes in classification lead to weak controls. On the C-risk exam, good answers usually link classification to control strength and visibility. In other words, accurate classification supports good governance. Configuration and version control help maintain a known good state for systems. In other words, they protect consistency. This means using baseline configurations and tracking all changes. In other words, know how things should look. If a system is altered outside the approved change process, that's a red flag. In other words, all changes must be authorized. Version control helps ensure that applications, operating systems, and control tools are current and compatible. In other words, outdated systems break systems. Configuration drift, when systems slowly change from their documented state, is often a precursor to failure. In other words, unchecked drift erodes trust. On the exam, answers that emphasize rollback readiness and consistency are often correct. In other words, look for governance in design and deployment. Change and asset management should integrate directly with GRC platforms. In other words, tools should support controls. When assets go offline or change unexpectedly, alerts should be triggered. In other words, you need to know when things shift. Change approval workflows can be linked to the risk register or incident response plans. In other words, change equals risk. Track it using a configuration management database or CMDB helps map asset relationships and dependency. In other words, know how systems connect. If a scenario says change occurred outside the GRC system, it usually means traceability or control integration failed. In other words, integration gaps cause risk blind spots. Monitoring is essential. In other words, data drives improvement. Change success rates, MTTR, mean time to repair, and unauthorized change attempts are all valuable metrics. In other words, measure to improve. Change logs and asset reports should be audited regularly, not just after an incident. In other words, prevention matters more than reaction. Periodic asset reconciliation ensures that records match reality. In other words, what's tracked must be true. Exception reporting, flagging things that deviate from the baseline, helps update policies and improve control design. In other words, outliers drive learning. On the exam, monitoring is not reactive, it's a continuous feedback loop that protects control reliability. In other words, monitoring keeps systems accountable. On the C-risk exam, operational failures usually link to missing lifecycle controls. In other words, risk shows up in what's not tracked. If asked what caused an incident, look for unauthorized changes or unmanaged assets. In other words, the root is usually operational. If asked what control was missing, consider whether approval, rollback, or documentation was present. In other words, find the broken step. If assets are reclassified or reassigned, the risk register and related controls must be updated. In other words, change means reassess. The best answers show end-to-end lifecycle visibility and enforcement, changes, assets, and decisions from request to review. In other words, the right answer always includes governance, structure, and accountability. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Bare Metal Cybersecurity Risk Prepcast. For more episodes, tools, and study support, visit us at baremetalcyber.com.